This is the first of 4 videos about the topic of price behavior, inflation, and deflation for Economics 53 in March 2020. This is meant to replace 2 lecture sets that would be delivered on a Tuesday and a Thursday. I've divided it into 4 because the videos are a little bit easier to watch when they're shorter. So let's get into this and see where we're going to go. 4 slide sets, and this one is going to be a visceral historical account of a very serious inflation and its aftermath, and you'll see what I mean when we get to that example. The second video will be the core video, the most important video, where most of the content is to be found, and that's where we are measuring inflation statistically, looking at measures over multiple measures of inflation and their definitions and their applications over time. The third video will be actually 2 parts. Neither part is long enough to make a separate video about. A separate discussion of deflation, which is the opposite of inflation, by discussing the effects and historical examples. And then also a review of the theories of inflation that we have already seen in this class. And then finally, the fourth is a discussion of anti-inflation policies that are currently being used. Now, this is going to be our first pass of that in the sense that we're not quite equipped yet to understand anti-inflation policies in detail. So we'll take a very general look at it now, just using the models. And at the end of the course, when we get to a discussion of the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy and understand how open market operations work, we'll return to the subject and review it in greater depth. Let's start by discussing a definition here. So what is inflation when we use that term? Well, it generally means there has been an increase in the price level for a country as measured by some acceptable price index, like in the United States, the Consumer Price Index, or any number of them. It generally implies that prices across the board in many areas are starting to rise. And usually if you're talking about inflation, you mean above some acceptable level. Now, these categories right here that I'm using reflect my definitions of these terms. Any economist can sort of say, well, moderate inflation is this or that. So this is what I use. If the general price level is actually negative, and that's rare, but it has happened, we refer to that as deflation. And we have a separate section of this lecture where we talk about that. If the inflation rate as measured by the CPI, for example, is between 0 to 2.5%, as it is at the time this video was made, that's a traditional, healthy, stable level of prices. A 2% inflation rate is not really regarded by anyone as serious inflation. It's probably actually good for the economy to some extent. When you get up to above 2%, 2.5% or 3% into the 5% range, then people start to become concerned. And the Federal Reserve System in particular becomes concerned because that is regarded as moderate inflation. You may recall that when we talked earlier in this class about inflation, we did discover, because of the effective inflationary expectations, that once an inflation begins, it has a near automatic tendency to get worse. So moderate inflation is regarded as serious inflation because there's a fear that it can go to the next step, which is high or very serious inflation. And that for a country like the United States would say be between 5 and 8%. And this is where policymakers are really starting to try to use some policies that are severe in some cases and ultimately harmful to the economy to bring the inflation down. By the time we get into the double-digit range, let's say from 8 to 12%, then we probably have runaway or self-compounding inflation. Inflation that, for whatever reason is the cause, is likely to become worse. If it's 10%, it's likely to go to 15. If it's 15, it's likely to go to 20. And then finally, when you get up into, for a large modern country like the United States, 12 to 20% or so, again, a fairly arbitrary range, but you get the idea. That's referred to as hyperinflation, and you have a very, very serious economic problem when that happens. Usually, whatever policy is necessary to stop that kind of inflation is going to have a devastating effect upon the economy. And then, of course, if you lose control and the inflation rate rises above 20%, that is explosive, and that is extremely dangerous. So let's take a look at a single example historically of how an inflation became explosive. And that's going to be the German inflation of the 1920s. It's a lecture I've been given for about 35 or so years. The German economy was devastated. At the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was not very fair to the Germans. And so the German economy suffered through a period of hyperinflation that was almost unimaginable. And I'm going to show you some visceral examples of that here in just a minute. And so one might say, well, how do you measure inflation, especially inflation, going back that far? The answer to that is if you're talking about really serious inflation, usually the devaluation of the currency, the change in the exchange rate, is a good indicator of how much internal inflation you have. In other words, if a currency devalues by 100%, then you're talking about more or less 100% inflation. So here's an example of the dollar to the mark exchange rate from 1914 to 1923. And you can see that this escalates over the period of time in question. So, for example, in July 1914, which was before World War I started, the $1 equaled 4.2 marks. By the end of the war, a war that the Germans, of course, lost, that exchange rate had fallen to 14. By July 1921, 2 years later, there was a much more serious inflation, and we were obviously getting inflation rates that were close to or above 100% per year, because they're now $1 equaled 40 marks, or 40 marks to the dollar. 1 year later, there was a tenfold increase in the rate of inflation, and the inflation rate fell to, the exchange rate, fell to 483 marks to the dollar, which represents a tenfold decay. And then finally, in July 1923, 1 year later, 353,412 marks to the dollar. 1 month later, not 1 year later, in August 1923, 4,620,455 marks to the dollar. 1 month after that, 98,869,000 marks to the dollar. 1 month after that, 25,260,208,000 marks to the dollar. And then finally, 1 month after that, November 1923, you can see the value right there. Years ago, I was walking through a park in San Dimas, and I spotted an old man sitting at a park bench with a big box of what appeared to be currencies, and he was selling it to people walking by. So I walked on over to see what it was, and he had a big box of mark notes from the era that I'm describing. He, I think, charged about 25 cents per note or something like that. So I bought a bunch of them because I thought they were historically significant. I regret that I didn't buy many more. I bought, I think, about 10 or so. So ever since I did that, I've included those notes in the lecture. Now, back in the 80s, when I first got these, I actually passed the notes around the class so that people could feel what these things felt like, because the early notes were very high quality. 3 or 4 color prints with a watermark that you could feel with your thumb. It was engraved on both sides, very high quality print. And then, of course, as time goes on, they began to deteriorate in quality. So here we're looking at a 21 April 1910 10,000 mark note. I'm not sure how much this would have been worth in 1910. It probably was worth quite a bit of money at the time. But when you take a look at, and this is before World War I, of course, when you take a look at it, you can see that it's very high quality. You can feel a watermark. It's unusually large for a note it's about twice as thick as a dollar bill is, or not twice as thick, but the height of it is about twice as far. When we get to 1920, the notes still have some quality to them. This is a 6 February 1920 10 mark note. This is the most valuable note in terms of its artistic value. This note is really beautiful. It's much more beautifully engraved than a modern day, say, $10 bill or a $100 bill. It's on very high quality paper, you can tell. It's either 3 or 4 color reproduction. It has 2 watermarks that you can feel. And if you take a look at the back of this same note, it's also very high quality. This is the back of that very same note. So this, of course, as I say, was in 1920, just about the time the inflation was ready to take off. We also have a 1 March 1921 mark note. Even this note is of relatively high quality. This watermark that you can see up here right there is very tactile to the thumb. And again, it multicolor print, again on very high quality paper. Well, you saw the example that I gave of the inflation implied by the exchange rate. We know that by the time we got to 1923, the situation was very serious and these currencies had devalued greatly. So the next currency we look at is a 9 August 1923 2 million mark note. Now, this 2 million mark note is of very poor quality. The paper quality is reasonably good. We only have 2 colors on it. There's no printing on the back. And as you can tell, this is not as elegant as anything we've seen before. Now, I've told my students that in September of 1923, I would bet that a wheelbarrow of these would not have bought a loaf of bread. This was mostly usable for fuel, I think. These were basically completely worthless by then. When we take a look at September 1923, this is a 50 million mark note. And this 50 million mark note would not have purchased a loaf of bread, at least in October. It might have when it was first issued in September, because again, we're getting thousands of percentage rates of inflation week by week by the time we get into this. And you can see once again, there are no watermarks on this note. The paper is of relatively poor quality. There still is some engraving quality, but this is the back of the 50 million mark note. And you can see there's no printing on it. There's a light underneath it, so you can see that the front is coming through. And so I have a few more of these, but you get the point. 50 million mark note would have not bought anything at all in 1923. Well, of course, that inflation during the time of the Weimar Republic is famous. And we know that it had consequences, and I'll remind you of the consequences. There was a general economic breakdown in Germany that reflected this inflation and led to a political breakdown in Germany, and that in turn led to these dire results. This is a picture that I took out of Wikipedia, where on January the 30th, 1933, right at the time the entire world by this time was going into a severe depression, Adolf Hitler is receiving the adulation of a crowd on the evening that he is inaugurated as the new Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Now, his political party was formed 10 years earlier, and he was building up support for that political party all during the time that followed immediately after this inflationary disaster. There are modern examples as well. Here is a $20,000 note from Zimbabwe. This was actually given to me by a student. I think it was loaned to me by a student whose mother had given it to him. I kind of vaguely remember the student told me that he would like to get it back, but I never gave it back to him. I don't think he asked me for it. If he did, then I apologize. At least it ends up practically in a lecture. And this is from the 2004 era. So I put this in a 2008 lecture, and I haven't actually changed what I wrote from the 2008 CIA fact book, because at the time, Zimbabwe had an unemployment rate of 80%, And the 20% of the adult population was identified as, that should say, HIV positive. And they had an inflation rate estimated to be about 100,000% per year in 2007. And then Zimbabwe, and so this, of course, reflects that $20,000 note couldn't buy anything at the time it was issued. I sometimes carried this around with me in my wallet, and if I'd go into a bar and I'd order a beer, I would put this $20,000 note out on the counter. And the bartender would say, "What the hell's this?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I gave you my $20,000 note. Here's 10." I don't think that the bartenders thought that was very funny. Anyway, Zimbabwe actually did curb that inflation in the about 7 or 8 years ago, but now the inflation is back, according to a source I'll have on a later slide. Zimbabwe currently has an inflation rate of 776%. So typically, when you have inflation levels as high as these extreme levels, you really have a smoking black hole economy. Now, before we move into the more moderate discussion of inflation in the next slide set, here are some of the higher levels of inflation that we see around the world today. And this is estimated by, these values, I should say, are estimated by Professor Stephen Hanke of the Johns Hopkins University, working in capacity of the Cato Institute. And so you know probably already that Venezuela has a horrendous inflation right now because of their generally very poor policies. The free market exchange rate is 69,000. I don't even know what their currency is called, whatever the Venezuelan currency is called, to the dollar. So he's estimating their inflation rate is 2,000%. He's comparing this to the IMF projection. He claims that their projections are way off, probably true. This is where I got the Zimbabwe number from. He's saying that the Zimbabwe inflation rate is 776%. You might imagine that Syria does not have a stable economy, and Syria currently has a 104% inflation rate. The Sudan has an 81% inflation rate, and even Argentina is beginning to experience some serious inflationary problems with an inflation rate of 68%. And again, to some extent, this is evaluated by the measure of the exchange rate of their currency to the dollar. Now, we're going to take a look at statistically how inflation is measured in the United States. And we're actually going to look at 5 different measures of inflation, emphasizing one, the most famous of them, the Consumer Price Index, which is more or less meant to be a sort of cost of living index for consumers. We're going to look at the group of producer price indexes briefly, which is supposed to measure the input costs for manufacturers and commodity costs. And we're going to look at the chain-weighted GDP price deflator, which is used to adjust GDP to real GDP. You may remember that when we looked at the national income and product accounts, we distinguished between the economic growth in nominal terms and economic growth in real terms. And we said the real value is adjusted for inflation. It is the chain-weighted GDP price deflator that makes that adjustment. Then we're going to look briefly at the historical behavior of the employee cost index, which of course measures the cost of labor. And this is often used by the Federal Reserve System as an early wage cost inflation indicator. So that's why we're going to look at it. And then we're going to take a look at the personal consumption expenditure inflation index, which is used also by the Federal Reserve as a primary price indicator. So that's the opening of this slideshow. Let's wrap this up and get on to the core lecture about these statistical measures.